Our New Testament lesson comes from Paul's letter to the church at Rome, chapter 12, verses 9 through 18. You may remember we read from Romans last week as we were thinking about the Reformation from the 3rd chapter, one of the verses that Luther found so important in working out the doctrine of the justification by faith. And the letter to Rome is very complicated and intricate and deeply theological. But finally, when we get to the 12th chapter, Paul is beginning to describe what life in the Christian community should look like, what the ethos of the Christian life should be. And it becomes very practical and very particular in many ways. And we're beginning to hear that in these verses. Chapter 12, verses 9 through 18. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil and hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless those and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. What does it cost to run a church? I've been thinking a lot about that question lately, partly because obviously it's stewardship season and it's the time of year when you are asked to make a financial pledge for next year's annual budget. And as part of the stewardship campaign, we find ourselves working once again to try and communicate as clearly as possible what the costs are, the financial costs are, in running a church. We brought the question of stewardship up to the session a couple of months ago, and they had a very honest and enlightening discussion. And what I heard many of the elders say was that in terms of the stewardship campaign, the material and the information that's presented, the actual budget numbers to them are not very important. They said the church's budget in and of itself isn't very inspiring or isn't very motivating toward the impulse to give. What they got excited about were the personal stories of how giving made a difference in someone's life. And those stories, as they began to share them with one another, became a very moving experience in the time of that meeting. And so following up on that, we asked some of the elders like Lauren Poore and Vicki Nickel to share some of their stories, which they've done so deeply, meaningfully, and powerfully. Their testimony of how giving is a work of God's grace in their lives is motivating. It is inspiring to me as I think about my giving to the life of the church. And so we even tied that into the theme of this year's stewardship campaign, which you can see on the front of the printed material, building on the stories of hope. But I haven't been able to let the numbers go, not altogether. In many respects, the numbers are a part of our stories too. The numbers tell our story. Think about it this way, as I heard someone say recently, if you wanted to know about someone, which would be a better resource to tell you about them? Their diary or their checkbook? James Hudnut Buehler is professor of American religious history at Vanderbilt University, an ordained Presbyterian minister, the son of a Presbyterian minister, and the author of a book called The Pursuit of Almighty's Dollar, a history of money and American Protestantism. And in a recent interview on the podcast Research on Religion, Hudnut Buehler was asked if he had any particular wisdom, anything that he had gained from his academic study and from his personal experience in the life of the church. He said that he thought it was an important exercise to exercise great candor when we were talking about money and fundraising in the congregation, to be as honest as possible about why we are doing it and what we are doing. He said we have to have integrity about what it takes to keep a church going. He said he thinks that we should have candid conversations in the church about what this is worth to you and why. We should be able to share with each other, even as Vicki was sharing with us this morning, why we are here, participating in this church, and what are the material, financial costs that make our participation possible. In other words, you should know what it costs to run this church. You should know it because it is important to the health of this body, this particular organization. Now, I bet that you have a pretty clear idea of how much it costs to run your household. How many times a day do you check your checkbook, or do you go online to look at your bank account? How many spreadsheets have you made up for yourself to give you a survey of your personal finances? There's nothing wrong with that. We call that being financially responsible. But for some reason, we sometimes treat the church's budget like it is a profane thing, not something to be discussed in public by polite church people. Or maybe we just find ourselves simply trusting that somebody else in this wonderful congregation will be responsible for it. And fortunately, we do have incredibly faithful and responsible members who are very careful as they watch over the church's financial budget. But nevertheless, each of you should still know how much it costs to run this church. For 2017, we budgeted $569,217 to run this church. And at the end of September, we had spent $416,760, or about 98% of the budget through September. Those aren't all the actual costs to running this church. Those are the budgeted costs. But we have many other costs that are additional on top of that, unexpected. But in terms of the things that we plan for, we plan spending based on what you give to the church. This church, $569,217. We have 9 church staff employees, including 2 youth workers, whom we pay 10 hours a week. And all of those staff are dedicated and faithful, and they do a wonderful job. But those total personnel costs come to $349,631. That's a little less than 60% of the church's budget. We budgeted $35,000 for property and liability insurance for 2017. I'm not sure if that's a surprise to you or not. I bet it's news to you. Did you know that that's how much we have to pay simply to have insurance for the church? Budgeted $32,000 for utilities. If you can turn the lights out when you're the last one in the room and bump up the air conditioner after I've bumped it and turned it down, you could help out maybe with that utility bill a little bit. We budgeted $5,000 for copier expenses. And trying to be faithful that we didn't redo this week's bulletins even after they had been printed upside down. But $5,000 for copier expenses, bulletins, newsletter, mailings. Our telephone bill, you want to guess how much that is? Well, no. Our telephone bill is $4,000 a year. I wish our family's cell phone bill was about that much, but these are not cell phones for the church. We've budgeted $21,000 for maintenance and repairs for this year. And that doesn't include any of the big ticket items that have happened in this year, like having to provide a new air conditioner, a new stove, and major kitchen plumbing repairs, all of which have been or in the process of being completed. You'd be surprised, I think you'd be surprised, at how much it costs to repair the light bulbs in the chandeliers that you're sitting under right now. We did that a few months ago. You may not even realize you were sitting in the dark, but many of you were sitting under chandeliers with half the light bulbs out. Just to have those light bulbs replaced with new light bulbs cost over $1,000. I haven't mentioned even what we budget for benevolence giving for the year. We tend to give almost 1/2 of what we budget for benevolence giving. We tend to give that much as well to special offerings during the year, like the offering we're having this morning and the mission fair offering. And I haven't even mentioned what we budget to spend on specific programs and activities. That's really just a minuscule part of our overall church's budget. I bet total less than 5%. What does it cost to run this church? The health of the church depends on you knowing how much it costs to run the church. And I think that if you can, you should get a copy of the church's budget. They're always available. We're glad to send one to you. Perhaps we should put one online. Because if you know how much it costs to run the church, then you can say, this church is important to me. I know what it costs for this church to operate and provide what a value for myself and for others, and I am going to contribute to help make it happen. If you don't know what it costs, if you don't have any idea at all and you're not really even interested at all, well, then maybe you can just say, well, this church just sort of happens somehow. It doesn't really depend on me. But that's not the truth. It does depend on you. The health of the church depends on your knowing how much it costs to run the church. And conversely, I think it is also true that your health, your well-being as a part of the church depends on you knowing how much it costs to run the church. Now, that idea may be a little bit less obvious, but I think it is nevertheless just as true, if not more so. Your health, your well-being as a part of this church, as a part of the body of Christ, depends on your knowing what it costs to run the church. It isn't that your health and your well-being depend on exactly what the church's budget is. But I do think your health and your well-being as a part of the church, as a part of the body of Christ, depends on your practice of giving to the church. Your practice of giving reflects your deepest values, your clearest affirmations about who you are. Your practice of giving is a concrete manifestation of your faith. Just as Vicki said, a little step, a little step, a little step every time you give. It is the heartbeat of your relationship with God. Is that too much to say? That your practice of giving is the heartbeat of your relationship with God? Don't we say that giving is the heartbeat of God's relationship with us? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And if that is the nature of God's relationship with us, then isn't the nature of our relationship with God somehow very much dependent on our practice of giving as we have learned it from God and as we've learned it from each other? I think it's interesting to me how stewardship season so often coincides with our celebration of All Saints' Day. It's wonderful how we can begin to think of how the lives of the saints, the people dear to you and me, whom we have known and whom we have loved and have been so important to us, how their lives and how their lives of giving of themselves in faith to us and to the life of this church, how it overlaps and becomes a part of our understanding of the nature and significance of giving and stewardship in our lives. Paul uses the call to the saints throughout most of his letters in the New Testament, so often identifying the saints in the particular churches that he's writing to, so often reminding them that they're called to be saints, that it is part of their vocation as who they are as Christians, to live into the life that God has given them, even as he identifies it here in this passage from the book of Romans. Contribute to the needs of the saints. It's very interesting that Paul doesn't say specifically what those needs are. Paul doesn't say, contribute to the needs of the saints in Rome. Their air conditioner broken. They need to replace it. Paul just says, contribute to the needs of the saints. And the word that he uses for contribute is a word that we're very familiar with, but primarily in its noun form. It's a form of the word koinonia, that Sunday school class that many of you are a part of. Is as though Paul is saying, be a part of the movement of koinonia, breaking forth amongst you. Be a part of that sharing. Be a part of that caring. Be a part of that giving. When the themes of stewardship and saints begin to overlap, I look up in the midst of the congregation and find myself seeing things that maybe not everyone sees, or maybe not that we look at every Sunday. I look out and see in the back some empty pews, and so often I might say to myself, why aren't those pews filled with people? But when the themes of stewardship and saints start to overlap, I look up and I see back there families that have sat there for years. I look up and I see the new ushering team for this month, an ushering team of women, and I see that they're not by themselves this month, but they're surrounded by that ushering team, which was so dedicated and faithful, made up of people, men whom you loved and knew. Sam Sanborn and Mike Heatwall and Bob Riddle and Beryl Godby, who went on to the church triumphant this morning. So it may look at first glance like it's empty back there and it's just women ushering, but then you look again and see how our lives are overlapping and the giving is making something real as a part of our faith. I look over and see Philip here today, and I'm reminded of his wonderful mother, Gloria, and the life of her service to this congregation, the ways that she and Jenny Knight parked out there on Colonial Drive Sunday after Sunday, those two old women courageous enough to park there and try and beat that traffic in. What a life of saints. I look up and I'm reminded of that Sunday not so long ago when Kim Ohio got up and spoke in the middle of the worship service. He said it was the Spirit getting into him talking, but I don't think it was the Spirit now so much as Bob Reagan's, who was giving him an elbow saying, hey, you, Kimo, get up, say something about this money. Say something about this money. Saints and their lives and their stewardship and their giving all sort of come together and we find ourselves caught up in a way that is bigger than we are alone, but that is new in the way the Spirit brings us together. I know I've shared with you my delight in reading a book by Wendell Berry called Jayber Crow, in which he recounts the life of a man, Jayber Crow, who grew up in a fictionalized town in Kentucky called Port William. His biological parents died shortly together a few days after he was born, and then for a few years he lived with his aunt and his uncle there in that town, but they both died also when he was a young child, and he was sent off to an orphanage as a part of the town, but eventually decided he needed to go try and find his own life, and went out, wandered around through Kentucky, ended up in Louisville, where he picked up the trade of being a barber, and eventually became dissatisfied with that life there, and felt like he needed to go back somehow and find his roots, find his origin. And so he made his way back to that town, Port William, and became a barber there, living above his little barber shop and interacting with all the people of that community and rediscovering himself. And in one particular passage, Berry writes of how Jayber Crow rediscovered the community of the church in that town, because he had been given the job of being the janitor in the church. In addition to his job of being the town's barber and the grave digger, he'd also been given the job of being the janitor. And he describes what it was like for him to go there to that church week after week and clean the facilities and then stay and watch the people come in. And in a particularly moving passage, he writes this, Jayber Crow reflecting on his presence in the church after cleaning it. He said, "One day when I went up there to work, sleepiness overcame me, and I lay down on the floor behind the pew to take a nap. Waking or sleeping, I couldn't tell which, I saw all the people gathered there who had ever been there. I saw them as I had seen them from the back pew, where I sat with Uncle Othie, who would not come in any further, while Aunt Cordy sang in the choir. And I saw them as I had seen them from the back pew on the Sunday before. I saw them in all the times past and all to come, all somehow there in their own time, and in all time and in no time. The cheerfully working and singing women, the men quiet or reluctant or shy, the weary, the troubled in spirit, the sick, the lame, the desperate, the dying, the little children tucked into pews beside their elders, the young married couples full of visions, the old men with their dreams, the parents proud of their children, the grandparents with tears in their eyes, the pairs of young lovers attentive only to each other on the edge of the world, the grieving widows and widowers, the mothers and fathers of children newly dead, the proud, the humble, the attentive, the distracted. I saw them all there. I saw the creases crisscrossed on the backs of men's necks, their work-thickened hands, the Sunday dresses faded with washing. They were just there. They said nothing, and I said nothing. I seemed to love them all with a love that was mine merely because it included me. And when I came to myself again, my face was wet with tears. When you come to this table this morning, come knowing that you're included. Come giving a thanks for a love that is yours because it has been given to you by a God who always gives, by a God who has given the lives of so many others so you can be present and give thanks today. Amen.